All right, folks, this is a topic that I have been thinking about for a very, very long time. And it's a topic of conversation and also a question for thousands, if not millions, of people that have come across this book over the thousands of years that it has been around. And those people are not just people who are in seminary or your casual Sunday morning Christian. This topic has been of interest to people who are secular historians, even children that come across that book for the first time. And that topic and that question is, how is this book, how is the Bible structured, right? What is the reason for the placement of these books that comprise the entire Bible? Is there some inherent logic, or are they just randomly placed? So this is something that has been covered by hundreds of theologians over the course of thousands of years. People have tried to decipher as to what exactly is the reason for the placement of the books in the Bible in that specific order. So there are some theories that are very valid as to the structure of the Bible. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at the current view of the structure of the Bible, and then I'm going to present a new view, a new look at the structure of the Bible. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to step by step walk people through the logic that I used to come up with this idea. This is something that I developed myself, and over the last few months, I have been trying to poke holes through this view, or this theory, if you will, this new look at the structure of the Bible, and I have not been able to poke holes through it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the comments open for people who are interested in this. And if you want to chime in on topic, obviously, because I don't care about Jews or Palestinians or Christians or Muslims or anything like that. I just care about this topic specifically. So I would like for people over the years or decades, however long this stays on the internet, to comment and let me know, or let them just simply express their thoughts on this idea and this view of the Bible, and see if they can find any issues with the logic behind it. So just to kind of give you the basics of this book. This book is by far the most popular book on earth. It was the first book that was printed, obviously audio. It's been translated in more language than any person on earth would ever know. It is incredibly influential. It's influential in literature. It's influential in art, as we know. It's influential in language, as it codified multiple languages. It's also influential in present-day culture, right? We have what they refer to as the Western canon. Movies are literally based on the logic of this book. It shapes policy without a doubt, and especially in English-speaking countries, and not just in English-speaking countries. It's also obviously a source of a huge amount of conflict, both in policy and in history, geography, and so on and so on. So it's very difficult to overestimate the influence this book has on society. The ideas that I'm going to present are clearly understood by anyone above the age of probably 12 years and 6 months. So it's nothing complex. And I will do my best to explain it as logically as possible so that even a child can understand that. And I will give you a little bit of a background as to what this book is about. So the Bible has been written over thousands of years. Now at this point, it is canonized, it is finalized, and it has been for a long time. I am using the King James Version, the King James translation, so it is a Protestant translation, and I will go into that later on as to why that matters. But that is the major assumption here, that I'm using the King James Version. It is a Protestant translation. The King James Version has been around since 1611, so roughly speaking, it is more than 400 years old. And of course, it is the most sold version translation of any other translation or version out there. It is absolutely phenomenal. The King James translation contains 66 books, okay? So imagine that. As fate would have it, 66 books. Those 66 books are written by more than 40 individuals. Now, there is a healthy number of books that are anonymous, and I'll discuss a few of them later on. So we're not precisely sure who wrote those books. That is beyond the point of this conversation. Now, going to the current understanding of the structure of the Bible. So in big picture, if you will, as far as a big picture view of what is going on here, is the book is split in two different, if you will, major sections, and that is the Old Testament, which is considered to be the Jewish book, the Jewish Bible, and then there's the New Testament, which describes the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Of course, you believe that if you're a Christian. If not, you may just have an interest in someone who shaped society the way that we view it today. The gap between those two sections, if you will, the gap in chronological number of years, is about 400 to 500 years. So this is completely not uncommon. In other words, it's very common for the Bible to have massive gaps, especially in the Old Testament, between events, and those gaps can sometimes be hundreds of years or more, right? The further back you go, the larger the gaps become. Sometimes you have a list of names that cover 1,000 years and you don't hear much about these people, and then things slow down and a year is talked about in multiple tens of pages, right? So that is, obviously, those are the two big sections of the Bible. Now, going into a little bit of a detail, and again, this is extremely simple. I'm not going to go too far in depth as to what each of these books represents, but generally speaking, the current understanding of the placement of books in the Old and New Testament. And when I point to the left, that's in the past, to the right is in the future. So my timeline is from left to right. Yours is going to be the opposite, unless you have me flip one way or another. But the Old Testament begins with the creation of the universe. So in the book of Genesis, we are told the history of the creation of the universe, and we're given a big picture idea of what in the world the entire book going forward is, okay? So that's how the Old Testament starts, and then the first 5 books, we presume, are written by a person named Moses. Those first 5 books are called the Torah, or they're called the Pentateuch, alternatively. And those are, and I have just a book open over here, just in case you wonder what I'm looking at. And I'm just literally looking at the index, the order of books on the first page, as you would find it in every single Bible on earth, right? So the first 5 books are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy, okay? And then that is what is referred to as the law, because through Moses came the law of God, and that's just to summarize the law, big picture. Once again, I'm not going to go into the details and describe 600 laws here, but we're talking about, let's just say, to summarize the law as the 10 Commandments, right? The 10 Commandments are given in those firsts in one of the books in the Torah or the Pentateuch, and then there's a whole lot of other detail that essentially beefs up, as you would say, that set of laws, right? Those set of commandments. What follows that, and again, I'm talking about our current understanding as to, and of course that understanding is very valid. I'm just going to present a slightly different view that complements and not necessarily replaces this view. What follows the first 5 books is the history of these people once they get into what is referred to as the Promised Land. And then after that, we have this person, Joshua, who was a contemporary of Moses. He simply obtains the baton. He's given the baton, and then he keeps talking about the history of these people that lived in that area. And then after Joshua, we have the judges, right? The judges, and I'll mention those here in a little bit. And then we go again, chronologically speaking, we go to, and the way that the canonical order is, we go into Ruth. The book of Ruth explains essentially the genealogy of this person named David, who eventually becomes King David, right? And after Ruth, we have the books of Samuel 1, Samuel 2, Kings 1, Kings 2, Chronicles 1, Chronicles 2. Don't judge me too harshly on, I just for ease of purposes say Samuel 1. I know it is the first book of Samuel, but just for purposes of understanding, this is how the order of books goes. So after Chronicles, we have Ezra and Nehemiah, and then we have Esther, then we have Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and then after this, we go into what is referred to as the prophets. Those prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah, and so on and so on. So the most widely accepted view of the structure of the Bible is, once again, you have the law, you have the prophets, and in between the law and the prophets, you have what is referred to as wisdom literature, okay? Wisdom literature is comprised, the wisdom literature books, the way that we view it today, predominantly, the wisdom literature is comprised of a set of books, and those are Job, right? And then we have Psalms. Those are the Psalms of David and a few other people. And then we have the Proverbs of Solomon, and then we have the Song of Solomon, and then we move into the prophets. Those prophets are sometimes explained as the major prophets and the minor prophets. The major prophets being Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. The minor prophets being people like Jonah, if you've ever heard. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and so on, right? Until we get to the New Testament. So that's just to summarize the structure as we have an understanding of it. The structure of the Old Testament, you start with the Torah, the Pentateuch, that is the law of Moses, somewhat of a chronological order, and then we get to Joshua, who continues that chronological order once they cross into the promised land, these people, this nation. And then after Joshua, we get through the Judges, which is a period of a few hundred years, and then we get to Ruth, and then the Kings, right? The Kings, and then, of course, the Kings would be 1st, 2nd book of Samuel, 1st, 2nd book of Kings, 1st, 2nd book of Chronicles, and then we get to Ezra and Nehemiah. Those people lived after the kings were destroyed, and then they were exiled into Babylon, and then they come back and rebuild the temple, and then we get into the prophets, okay? The prophets, once again, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so on and so on. And then the Old Testament, or the Jewish canon, essentially ends with the last book of the Old Testament, which is called Malachi. And then, if you're a Christian, you continue reading, and then the New Testament opens up with the Gospels of Jesus Christ, okay? So the Gospels of Jesus Christ, those are, once again, the gospel means good news, right? Good news. Those are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then those are the Gospels of Jesus Christ, 4 books that essentially repeat the life, death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ in slightly different format, slightly different style, literally style, and slightly different view, as they were written by different people, right? And you can tell that in the style, you can tell that there are multiple clues, linguistic clues, that you can tell those books were written by different people, right? What we have after the Gospels is the book of Acts, and then Acts is essentially a chronological continuation of more or less what happens after Jesus Christ. And then after the book of Acts, we have the letters, the epistles of Paul, right? We have the epistles of Paul, and those are, as you've probably heard them before, the book of Romans, Corinthians, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and so on and so on. And then we get to the book of Hebrews. Hebrews is written by an anonymous author. People over the last few thousand years have tried to figure out who in the world wrote that book, because it is absolutely brilliant, if not the most brilliant theological dissertation of the life of Christ, the divinity of Christ, as well as the philosophy of Christianity. So it is absolutely brilliant. There are a few people that are candidates as to the authorship of this book. Very difficult for me. I've thought about this for years. Very difficult for me to narrow it down to any single person, including one woman who is a very, very good candidate to have written that book. We'll probably never find out unless I get some sort of a divine revelation as to who in the world wrote that book, but it is absolutely phenomenal. It's just theology in brilliance, right? And then after Hebrews, we have James, Peter, John, and then we have Jude, and then we have the book of Revelation, okay? So our current understanding is that the structure, big picture view from a Christian standpoint, the structure of the Bible is you have Moses and the law, and then you have chronological order of the judges, the kings, then you have what is referred to as wisdom literature, and then you have the major prophets, as they call them, then the minor prophets, and then you have the New Testament, which includes the Gospels, right? And then the epistles. And then, of course, Hebrews is also theology. And then you go into the James, and then you end with James and Jude and Peter and so on. And then you end with the book of Revelation, which essentially completes the entire Bible, right? That's the last book of the Bible. Okay. So that's our current understanding. And once again, this is something that I've been thinking about for a very long time. This proposed idea of looking at the structure of the Bible, and I want to present that, and I'm going to try once again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to try to make it about as easy as possible for people to understand, and I would like to have some feedback if anyone is interested in this kind of stuff as to whether this makes any sense or not. Okay, so here's how it goes. Of course, I'm not invalidating this view at all. I'm just presenting a slightly different idea, okay? So once again, I'm just simply looking at the index over here, the canonical order of the books, not alphabetic, but canonical, the way that they are presented in the King James translation of the Bible, along with every other Protestant version of it. So we start with the book of Genesis, right? The book of Genesis gives us a very big picture perspective of what this book is about, right? So the book of Genesis tells us about the creation of the universe, and then it tells us about sin, right? That's the sin that Adam committed. And then it also ultimately looks forward and says that that one day will be corrected, right? There will be redemption and things are going to go back to the perfection that was ruined by the sin of this one man, right? So, if you will, that is the one, there's just literally one or two verses that summarize that sin and the redemption, and that is that the child of the woman will crush, right, that serpent, that old serpent, and then that old serpent will bruise the heel of that child of that woman. So that is a look forward to what essentially Jesus Christ accomplishes, and also is a look forward to how the world ends, and then what happens after that, the world that we know it today ends. And that is, we revert back to perfection, right? And then, of course, I'm not going to go into who's going to go where, but that's generally the idea of the book of Genesis. And then it goes into chronological order as described by Moses. Of course, God revealed this history to Moses in the mountain, right? So he personally told him what is going to happen, what's happened in the past and what's also going to happen in the future to an extent, right? So that is a personal revelation. People, as far as I know, did not take documentation prior to I guess Noah, I don't know, it doesn't matter. At some point, one way or another, that was revealed to Moses, and the complexity of the writing style is an absolute clue that this could not have theoretically been transferred through other means outside of written language, right? But that's a completely different topic. So once we get past the first few, if you will, this is how I look at this book. The way that I look at this book is that it is in chronological order, until it's deliberately not in chronological order. And I'm going to explain that and show you how this is a valid argument and it's a logical conclusion from beginning to end, okay? So, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers is 100% chronological order of events, right? Starting with the creation of the universe, and then you move through Noah, and then you get to Abraham, and then you go through the patriarchs, right? Isaac, his son, Jacob, his son, Jude, his son, and all the 12 brothers and one sister of Jacob, who was renamed to Israel, right? And then once we get to past the book of Numbers, right? Moses presents the law in Leviticus primarily. And then we get to Numbers. So we follow a chronological order in the first 4 books. Once again, Genesis, right? Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, chronological order. And then something extremely strange happens for the first time in this book. And that is in the book of Deuteronomy, okay? So the book of Deuteronomy, and just the name itself means twice, double law, essentially, right? We're going backwards in time. So what the book of Deuteronomy does is the first time we see this structure, which again, I will explain how this repeats over and over and over again in the future books. What happens in the book of Deuteronomy is Moses, and of course that book is probably completed by Joshua because Moses at one point dies. What Deuteronomy does is it simply loops you back around to the beginning, okay? To use a corporate term that I hate and every time I hear I want to throw up on my keyboard, it circles you back, okay? But it also does something else. It points you forward. So it's not just a circle, it is a spiral. So if you're looking at what I'm doing right now with my hands over here, because once again, I don't have any images to put on your screen, what it does is chronologically, it starts chronological order, 4 books, and then it gets to Deuteronomy, and then what that book does is it just simply takes you back to and repeats, it summarizes what happened in the previous 4 books in a language that is actually a little bit from a bigger picture perspective, and it's also much easier to read, okay? That's something that is it's a crucial component of my theory over here. So once again, we have chronological order. Deuteronomy takes you back to the beginning, more or less, and then it repeats in different words what all was explained in this book, and then it points you forward to someone that is going to come, a prophet like Moses, right? So now, this accomplishes multiple things, and I'll discuss that at length a little bit later on. But after you have gone through some of those first books are very difficult to read, and especially when you get towards the end of Exodus and into Leviticus, it becomes very difficult to read because there are a bunch of laws. It's extremely confusing. And then you get into Numbers, even though the book of Numbers, just the name assumes that it's more difficult, it actually the language eases up a little bit. And then you get into Deuteronomy, which is probably, well, let's just say that it's one of my favorite books in the Pentateuch or in the Torah, as you have it in the first 5 books. The language there eases up a little bit, so you kind of catch a break. You not only get to hear, again, a summarized view of what happened in the previous 4 books, but it also, the language eases, so it's very pleasant to read, okay? Now, what happens after this loop around, this spiral, and this arrow pointing forward? What happens then is we revert back to, guess what? A chronological order of events. So, let's see what happens after Deuteronomy. We have the book of Joshua, right? Joshua was a contemporary of Moses. So he is one of the few people, along with Caleb, in the generation that entered into the desert, right? Entered into the desert after Exodus, after the escape out of Egypt. And then he's one of the few people that survived because he listened to the word of God and he had no doubts about that, what was promised. He survived those 40 years of meandering through the desert, whatever area that is. And then he ends up in the promised land, unlike Moses, who did not make it out. So Joshua completes the last book of the Pentateuch of the Torah, and then what we have once again, just as we had in the beginning, is another chronological order, okay? So we get to Joshua. Joshua explains the first few years, decades, whatever it is, out of the time that these people spend in the so-called promised land. And then after Joshua, we have Ruth, right? Pardon me. After Joshua, we have, I knew I was messing this one up. After Joshua, we have the book of Judges, right? So the Judges follow Joshua. They're not kings, even though one, Ahimelech specifically, he tried to become a king. He was never anointed by God. But those judges are people appointed by God to preside over this nation, as it was in the first few decades, hundreds of years in the promised land, okay? So it is a chronological order, Joshua, Judges, right? Those lived in sequential chronological times. And then the book of Judges includes people such as Samson, if you've ever heard of Samson and Delilah, and then we have other people who are lesser known to the casual reader of the Bible, but those are phenomenal people, such as Gideon, Jephthah, and multiple others that, Barak, and so on, multiple others that are in this book that chronologically, right, sequential time, describes what happened in the promised land in those first 300-400 years after they entered into it, right? So after the book of Judges, you have, once again, another chronological order book, and that is the book of Ruth. So Ruth is the great-great-great-grandmother of David, who in turn becomes King David. So once again, chronological order from Joshua through Judges into Ruth, and then we get into Samuel 1, Samuel 2, right? So once again, Samuel 1 and Samuel 2 is 100% chronological order of events, historical events. So you start with King Saul, then you get to King David, and then you get to King Solomon, and then you get to Rehoboam, and so on and so on. And so it goes Samuel 1, Samuel 2, then you get into the Kings 1, Kings 2. Back in the days, this was one book, those Samuel, 1st, 2nd book, Samuel, 1st, 2nd book of Kings, Chronicles as well. They were just one book. I believe that book is originally called Kings in the original language, which is Hebrew of the Old Testament. Just a reminder, the New Testament was written in Greek, okay? Once again, chronological order until, guess what happens? Until we get to the books of Chronicles, right? So we have Chronicles 1, Chronicles 2. The first book of Chronicles was the first book of Chronicles in a very similar fashion, very, very similar fashion to Deuteronomy. Once again, it takes you back to the first book of Samuel, okay? So it's kind of like this. You have chronology. Deuteronomy takes you back maybe 75% of the chronological order towards the beginning. Then it continues in chronological order. You get to the book of Chronicles. Once again, it takes you back. So it's a spiral, right? It takes you back to the first book of Samuel and repeats events that are relevant to the kingdom of Judah specifically, okay? So this is the second time this big picture, I want you to think about it as a big picture loop, okay? Big picture spiral that goes back, say, 75% of what was described so far, okay? And then you get Chronicles, the first book of Chronicles, the second book of Chronicles. Take a wild guess what happens after the second book of Chronicles, right? We once again enter into historical chronological order of events, okay? And before I get to that chronological order of events, I want to once again point out that first book of Samuel, second book of Samuel, first book of Kings, second book of Kings, prior to you getting to the book of Chronicles, which loops you back around to Samuel, they are obviously multiple books, and they contain an incredible amount of detail, okay? The book of Chronicles, in a very similar fashion to the book of Deuteronomy, summarizes those events with a focus on what is important. Extremely uncanny resemblance to the book of Deuteronomy that does precisely that, right? It takes you back in a language that is easier to read, and then it retells the most important facts that are going to matter in the future with an arrow pointing towards in a chronological order, right? And then, once again, after the book of Chronicles, as I noted, we get to Ezra and Nehemiah. Those are, once again, chronological order of historical events that happen after the end of the second book of Kings, where they get exiled, which is repeated in the book of Chronicles. So now they are in the exile, and they are coming back to this place called Jerusalem and in the land of Canaan, and then they rebuild the temple, rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and then there's a chronological order of events. And then at that point, after the book of Esther, essentially, chronologically speaking, the Old Testament is finished, okay? So that is the Jewish canon from a chronological standpoint. Now, the book itself does not end there, but from a chronological standpoint, from the creation of the universe through the return of these people with the edict of Cyrus, the Persian, to return back to their own lands, that ends the chronological order of events in this book. But the actual book does not finish yet, right? What do we have after the book of Esther? This is where, in our current view, the predominant view is where we go into what is referred to as wisdom literature, okay? I have no argument against that. I want to just give you, once again, a slightly different perspective on what's going on here. So the book that follows, and this is absolutely brilliant, and if that book did not follow Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah, I would have just completely ignored this type of view because it would make absolutely no sense. But the book that follows the exile and the return back to Jerusalem, which happens in about mid-millennia, about 500 years prior to Christ, before Christ, what the following book is called the book of Job. This is, in our current understanding, the beginning of wisdom literature, which I have no doubt that is the case. But what the book of Job does is something absolutely incredible. What it does is, first of all, you've been going, if you read that book sequentially, and I'm going to emphasize that I'm talking about sequential reading of the Bible and why that is important to those of us that are interested in this. What follows, what the book of Job talks about is, after you've gone through the kings, now you have armies, you have chariots, you have horses, you have archers, you have wars, you have soldiers, you have military, all kinds of stuff. What that book talks about, it takes you back to the days of the camels and the days of Abraham, right? This person, Job, clearly did not live at any point in time other than Abraham or prior to Abraham. So it takes you back all the way to the beginning, okay? It takes you all the way back to the book of Genesis as far as chronological order is concerned. So this is a massive loop. And what that book talks about is existential issues that everyone on earth believes, whether they believe in God or not, they face. And that is the problems of evil in society, right? And whether God is fair or not, okay? Whether he's a just God or not. So that's what this book talks about. But it loops you back all the way to the beginning in a style that is very different from any other, I'm talking about writing style, narration style, that is very difficult from any other book so far in this Bible, right? If you read it sequentially. But once again, it loops you back all the way to the Abrahamic times. How do we know that? Well, first of all, this book is considered to be, archaeologically speaking, by far it's considered to be the oldest book that was ever written. Stylistically, it's clear that this book was written prior to Moses because the style is so different. There are hundreds of words that are, or at the very least dozens of words that are unique to the Bible. They're not encountered anywhere else. It talks about people living a very simple life. There are no soldiers, no armies. He lives on a property. He's got a bunch of, obviously, cattle, and a very wealthy man. Almost appears to be completely right. There's no mass production of weapons. There's no he just lives the simple, good old life, as we would phrase it. Even though Solomon told us specifically that don't ever think that there were those good old days. Everything is the same. There's nothing new under the sun. So Job takes you, that's the first book in what was referred to as wisdom literature. And also, in my view, it's the first book after the chronological end of what is described in the Old Testament that takes you all the way back and discusses theological, if you will, philosophical questions that all of us face. And apparently we have been facing those questions for thousands of years, right? What's even more uncanny is, guess what follows after the book of Job? The Psalms of David. Okay, so it takes you, once again, we follow from a philosophical, theological standpoint, wisdom standpoint. We go from Abrahamic times to the times of the kings, right? We go right again, except we go in those times where there were soldiers, where there were armies, where there were weapons, where there were wars, right? We go into the Psalms of David, and of course, David talks about from a first-person view of what issues he was facing during those times, right? Because David is described in the first book of Samuel, second book of Samuel, Kings, etc., right? And then in Chronicles as well. But then he gives you a first-person view of what he felt emotionally, what he faced whenever he lived, okay? So once again, the chronology breaks, but within the loop of wisdom literature, the chronology is once again there, right? It's once again, even though it's wisdom literature, even though it's not chronologically placed in the middle of the Bible, it takes you back to Abraham through the book of Job, and then you get to the Psalms of David, which take you back to the times of the kings, right? And then guess what follows? Of course, at this point, I hope that you get my idea of this spiral with a point forward. Of course, David talks about who's going to come after him, right? As that is a promise God gave him, that through his seed will come Christ the Messiah, right? So what happens after the book of Psalms, what comes after the book of Psalms is, you got it, the book of Proverbs, right? So those are the Proverbs that Solomon, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, wrote. And that is explicitly stated in the first line of that book, right? Proverbs. Or that was in Ecclesiastes. One way or another, you get the idea. David's Psalms give you a first-person picture of events on earth through his time, and then you get to his sons, Proverbs, and those Proverbs are just truly the epitome of wisdom literature on earth, right? They tell people, not just those who believe in God, they tell people how to live their lives and to get the most out of it, right? So there's purpose and meaning behind his idea of the Proverbs. They apply to everyone on earth. They don't apply just to Christian. It's not philosophy of Christianity. It's not theology. Of course, he looks at it from the point of view of God, but those Proverbs apply to everyone on earth, regardless of faith, okay? And then what follows Proverbs is Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is, once again, very, in a sense, secular philosophy. You can almost separate the book of Ecclesiastes and Solomon's writings and say that, well, maybe he didn't even believe in God, even though he talks about God. If you take away those references, the book of Ecclesiastes is essentially looking into what is the purpose, what is the meaning of life, what is the whole point, right? That's what Solomon does in a brilliant fashion. I haven't found anything in a dozen pages, whatever it is, 20, 30 pages. If you look at it as laid out in a normal book, you would find out that that book is absolutely phenomenal. It is difficult to understand, but one way or another, it is still brilliant. And then what follows Ecclesiastes is the book called Song of Solomon. Or Song of Songs, sometimes call it. Once again, that is essentially a poetic view of love. It's a love story, if you will, encoded with a whole lot of meaning in it. So it's not just secular love as we understand it. It talks about divine love as well and stuff like that. Now, this is where the so-called wisdom literature ends, right? So Then what we have is, once again, we have a chronological order of the prophets. So you take Isaiah. Isaiah is the first one. He lived after Solomon, way after Solomon, 100 years after Solomon. But what the prophets give you is, starting with Isaiah and then Jeremiah and then Ezekiel, they give you a first-person picture. And of course, it's a prophetic picture because they talk about stuff that is going to happen in the future, but they're also talking about events that happened throughout their lifetime. So the book of Isaiah talks about the events that happened through several kings that are described in the book of Kings. So he takes you once again past chronological order, or at least canonical order in the books. He takes you back to the kings and talks about, from his point of view, what on earth was going on earth, right? Pun intended over here, I guess. But that gives you it gives you an incredible perspective of life throughout those years that we only got a chronological understanding of historical events. So in the book of Kings, it tells you that this king did that king did that, and so on and so on. And then these people got exiled out of this land and into Babylon, and then they returned back. Isaiah's writing gives you a first-person perspective of the essentially physical reality on earth. Those are the boots on the ground, right? He tells you this was what's going on. This is why these people were exiled, right? Because they were doing this. They were burning their children. They were into all kinds of stuff other than God. They were crushing the poor, right? Dishonoring their parents, and so on and so on. So he gives you an explanation of events that you read about hundreds of pages prior to Isaiah, okay? So now, this is assuming, of course, it's assuming that you read the book sequentially, starting from beginning to end, and you see this endless, essentially, loop around and spiral that takes you back and re-examines events that happened in the past. Now, I've had some people come to me and say, well, I've read the New Testament, and I went, and the Old Testament is very intimidating, so I went to the book of Isaiah, and I wanted to just read the book of Isaiah and see, because he's such a, what we refer to as major prophet. Jesus Christ quotes him all the time, right? So these people, in good faith and in goodwill, open up a book that they perceive to be randomly placed, independent, written by someone, and they start reading, and guess what? They're completely lost, right? They're completely lost in it. I didn't understand anything in that book, which makes 100% logical sense. This book is not meant to be understood in isolation. It's meant to be read in sequential order, okay? Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't open that book and read it. Go ahead and read it. I'm just saying that you may get not just intimidated, you may just lose the desire to read out of the Old Testament altogether, because this is complex and it's something that has been built upon over thousands upon thousands of years of knowledge, okay? So the book of Isaiah has first of all, so much allegory. Allegory is introduced in the book of Genesis, and then it's slowly built up upon. So you get an idea of divine allegory. So you would never be able to understand allegory unless it's in basic terms. And you would never be able to understand what Isaiah is telling us. There's not just the allegory that has been built upon over thousands of years. It's also historical and geographical knowledge. The book of Isaiah is rife with historical and geographical facts. And it talks about the history of people, including names, including number of years, including sequence of events. So from a historical standpoint, this guy was an absolute powerhouse because he's able to recreate the entire story and use allegory to tell you the whole idea of his book, right? But it's not just history. It's what else? It's geography. There are hundreds of geographical locations named, and where people are going to go, where people are going to come from, why they rely on certain kingdoms that have been explained over hundreds and hundreds of pages prior to you getting to Isaiah. So the reason that people don't understand that book and it's so difficult to them is not because they're stupid, right? The reason is because they simply don't have context. They don't have the knowledge that is required to get to that point. So it's very similar to, if you will, and I'll probably use that analogy again. So think about it this way. It's very similar to being presented a mathematical problem and its solution. Okay? So it's both a mathematical problem and its solution, and you're looking at it without having basic knowledge in math, and then you can't figure out what in the world is going on. And of course you won't be able to unless you know the basics that got you to that point. You would never understand either the problem or the solution to a complex mathematical problem unless you know, you have the knowledge that it is required, right? This is whenever you go in school, it's the same thing, right? You sign up for a class and they tell you, this is required, right? This is required. You cannot sign up for this class unless you've taken this class. It's the exact same principle here. Or in other words, school is built on the exact same principle, and I'll get into that here in a little bit. But this is not just Isaiah. This is not just Jeremiah. This is not just Ezekiel. This is not just Jonah, Micah, and so on and so on. This goes to the beginning, okay? So, and one of the things that strikes me, and it's in the book of Judges, specifically, I don't know why, it always struck me as absolutely brilliant, is this judge. His name is Jephthah, okay? And Jephthah lived after Joshua, obviously after Moses. So imagine, I don't know, about, let's just say 1,300 years before Christ, or 3,300 to 3,500 years ago. Jephthah was an absolute brute. He was a fearsome warrior, and he was also a commoner. He wasn't, you can tell in his writing style that, specifically I'm going to talk about a letter that he wrote to the king of Ammon, and you can tell in his writing style that he doesn't possess complex, literally, style, syntax. Just his narrative is simple, okay? He's simple. What struck me about that letter, so here's what the context is, and I'll tell you exactly why I'm talking about this. The context is that he's about to get attacked. His land that he lives in, that he's lived in for generations, is about to be attacked by the king of Ammon. And he sends the king of Ammon a letter that is verbatim described, right, listed in the book of Judges. And in that letter, Jephthah, one of the judges appointed by God to preside over his people, in that letter to the king that is trying to attack him, he presents this historical dissertation analysis of the land that Jephthah lives in and the king of Ammon wants to attack. And he's telling the king in a very logical manner, lists out the history. Here's what happened from the beginning. And then this is where we are today. You have no claim on this land. If anyone has a claim on this land, it's the king of Bashan, who has been dead for hundreds of years. If you had any claim to this land, you should have brought that claim 300 years ago. You have zero claim. Why are you trying to pick a fight with me, right? Why are you trying to pick a fight with me? He lists out a chronological order of events. So very similar to the book of Isaiah, he takes you on a loop back through history and repeats the events that happened prior to him that you read in hundreds of pages prior to getting to the book of Judges. He repeats that, explaining to the king of Ammon, you have no claim on this land. Tell me, why are you trying to pick a fight with me? Okay? Extremely logical layout in simple terms. Apparently, the guy had extraordinary knowledge, even though you can tell stylistically that he's just a commoner. In other words, he's not some sort of a scribe that has just spent decades poring over books, right? Well, guess what? The king of Ammon has zero argument with that, and he doesn't even respond. Instead, what he does is he just simply attacks. And then unfortunately for the king of Ammon, he gets completely obliterated in of course, huge mistake, because first of all, he's going into a land that he's never had any claim on. That's one historical fact. Second of all, he goes into a land that he's unfamiliar with. This guy, Jephthah, he's a monster. Essentially, he just rounds people up and just completely destroys him with a much smaller force. So, in other words, the king of Ammon gets what he deserves. But my whole point is that just like the book of Isaiah, whenever you read some of this, you may not be able to grasp it because you have no knowledge of the sequence of historical events that occurred prior to that. And therefore, you may read that and understand, okay, he's making an argument here that I don't understand. But then if you had read that sequentially, you would know precisely what he's doing. He's describing events that you've already read. So in other words, he's repeating the same thing that you already know. You know that he's got no claim. The people that had claim on that land and that could have potentially claim on that land, they're long dead. They don't exist anymore. Neither do their children, neither do their cities. Essentially, they were completely obliterated as a burnt offering to the Lord, so to speak, right? So, once again, once you get past the prophets and you continue with the other prophets, Jeremiah, same thing. Jeremiah's writing style is much simpler, and his allegories, his analogies are easier to understand than Isaiah's. They're more grounded in reality. They're not as cosmic. They're not as complex. But still, you need to have some knowledge of allegory. You need to have some knowledge of what happened prior to that, because, of course, he also mentions a huge ton of historical events. He also mentions a huge ton of geographical places and so on and so on. And again, both Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and everyone else, including David and Solomon prior to them, they take you constantly on a loop back, right? They just internally within each of these books, there's a massive circular type of style. They take you back and explain, this is what happened, this is what happened, this is where we're at, this is what happened, this is what happened, this is where we're at, right? And this is so obvious, you just simply cannot ignore that. It's just a constant repetition of the same things, except in different style by different people that live in different times, right? And then you get through what is referred to as the minor prophets. They also, their style is, once you get towards the end of the Old Testament, the writing becomes a little bit easier as well. Just like in Deuteronomy and just like in Chronicles, you get through some very complex writing, complex allegory, complex theology, and then when you get towards the end, the language loosens up, right? It becomes easier to read. So I can power through Zechariah all the way through Malachi in no time, even though it's the same number of pages. But Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, which are much more difficult to read, they come prior to that, and the language just simply does not allow you to move through them fast, okay? And this wraps up that feedback loop that I was talking about. This is the Old Testament in the Jewish canon that is presented in the King James translation of the Bible. So just to kind of give you a summary of the Old Testament, you start chronologically, you get to Deuteronomy, loops you back around, circles back, my favorite corporate term. Then once again, you get chronology going on through the Kings, and then Chronicles loops you back around. Then you go to the so-called wisdom literature. Job takes you all the way back to the beginning, addresses complex philosophical, whether you believe in God or not, and theological issues as to the why evil exists, why do bad things happen to people, and so on and so on. And then you get through the Psalms. Once again, David takes you on the ground through his emotional style, which is unparalleled, in explaining what he encountered while he was king, prior to him being king. Then you get to Solomon, the wisest man that ever walked the earth. He gives you a philosophy of life. And then you go to the prophets, which also give you a first-person picture of the events that happened in depth, right? In depth into why stuff was done. Why did God do what God did? What happened and why did it happen? And just to kind of fill that picture of what happened in that historical narrative, in that historical document that you read prior to that. And then you get to the New Testament, okay? Once again, there's a gap of 500 years before the Old Testament and the New Testament. Once you get to the New Testament, you start with the Gospels of Jesus Christ, right? So those Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. What's the Gospels do? First of all, they chronologically describe the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Each one of them chronologically describes that. However, this is something that is, of course, not new as far as this structure that I'm presenting, but it is a little bit more thorough. What we get through the words of Christ is a massive amount of looping around, circling back. Because Jesus Christ talks about what? He talks about the creation of the universe. He talks about sin and redemption, right? He talks about what? The historical records. He talks about the judges. He talks about, he starts with Abraham, right? He talks about Abraham. He talks about then what? He talks about Moses. He talks about, Abraham, just to kind of go back a second. He talks about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, aka Israel, and then their kids. He talks about the kings. He talks about King David a whole lot. He talks about Solomon. Then he talks about the prophets. So he loops you constantly around. And we all know that the New Testament, that is a well-known fact, is essentially comprised of just quotes of what happened and how what happened is pointing to that one person called Jesus Christ and to his divinity, right? To his forever rule on earth and in heaven. So he takes you through it's just a constant repetition of what in the world happened in the previous 2,000 pages, however long the Old Testament is, right? And then this is reinforced multiple times through these 4 Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in that order, they repeat the exact same birth, life, death, resurrection of Christ. And through his words, they take you back to the beginning and they walk you around through the entire Old Testament. That's why a whole lot of people start by reading the Bible, start by reading the New Testament, because you get a general idea of what happened prior to that, right? And that's why they call it the New Testament. They call it the Cowboy Bible, if you've never heard of that one. That's a pretty cool one. Because they only had so much time, right? You just powered through the New Testament, and then you go, I don't know, herd cattle or just shoot up a brothel. It doesn't matter, but they just had so much time, so they call it the Cowboy Bible, right? What follows after the Gospels in the New Testament? What follows after the Gospels is, once again, you have chronological order. So the Gospels loop you around, point forward to what's going to happen way in the future, our future, end of the world, end of the universe, new universe. The book of Acts, once again, starts following chronological order of these people who lived. Those were the disciples, the apostles of Christ, right? And those are the Lukes and the Pauls and so on. And then it takes you in chronological order, historical chronological order, as to what happened when they went preaching, right? Decades in some cases after Jesus Christ. And then that's another chronological order. In a very similar fashion, once that chronological order ends, what we have the letters, the epistles of Paul. And what they do is very similar to the prophetic literature of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and so on. They take you back to the events that occurred throughout the life of Christ, and they fill the blanks, essentially. They fill the gaps in the story as to why this happened, why it happened the way that it did, and what is the purpose of it. So it just, once again, placed out of chronological order, but it fills the gaps in the story that you have read so far in the New Testament, right? And then this type of, with Paul's letters, of course, that starts with the book of Romans, and then it goes through, once again, just to kind of reiterate here, we have Romans, and then Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians, Timothy, Titus, Philemon. Those are the theological thoughts of Paul as written to various churches. That's what these names are, towns, cities that had churches, and filling in the gaps of what was not said, while at the same time repeating historical facts. So once again, he's just circling back, looping back around, and then pointing the arrow forward. This is what's going to happen in the future, right? And then we get to the book of Hebrews, as I noted earlier, the one with the anonymous author. The book of Hebrews is an escalation. It's an escalation in theology, right? It's an escalation in complexity, very similar to Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, that just, it is the height of theology, right? I mean, this is, as I noted, it is a dissertation of the philosophy of Christianity and the divinity of Christ. Brilliant book, short, but at the same time, it just takes you all the way to the beginning, to some random events that you wouldn't even think they would come up again, yet they come up again, right? We're talking about the Melchizedek, the priest, and so on and so on, the cloud of witnesses. Then it takes you through the judges one more time and tells you these people were exemplary, right? They were exemplary as far as their faith goes. And then in a very similar fashion, past the book of Hebrews, when we get into what? James, Peter 1, Peter 2, John 1, 2, 3, and Jude, that's when the language once again loosens up, very similar to the minor, so-called minor prophets that are after Ezekiel. And then the language loosens up and you can just actually power through them very easy. It just kind of grounds you. It grounds you and kind of lets you reset your mind. Okay. And then the Bible itself ends with the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation does something once again that is absolutely extraordinary and fits perfectly within the logic of the structure that I'm trying to explain. The book of Revelation, it takes you straight to the beginning, and in incredible parallel, right? There's absolutely no doubt that the book of Revelation is written by a completely different person than who wrote the book of Genesis. I mean, there's absolutely zero arguments, but it takes you back to, and it in parallel structure presents, it's uncanny what the parallels are between the book of Genesis and the book of Revelation. So the book of Genesis talks about creation and then destruction and fallen world. The book of Revelation talks about destroying the world in kind of almost in an inverse order, destroying the world and then going back to perfection, right? It talks about sin. It talks about redemption. It talks about departure from God through the sin of one man, and redemption through the life and death and resurrection of another man. So the parallels are absolutely uncanny. It just talks about, especially in the last few pages, very similar to the first few pages of the Bible. The last few pages of the Bible are essentially an inverse kind of mirror image of what's going on, just a huge circle. And then, of course, it discusses all kinds of other things that are topics of conversation throughout all times, the Antichrist and all that stuff, right? I'll have to charge someone $5,000 like some people do on earth today to talk about the Antichrist from someone whose sickness is this book. But you kind of get the idea. Just as a summary, the Bible is in chronological order until it's deliberate and not. It just simply takes you back through these constant loops throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia. And each book is ultimately a loop in its own self. So they're just constant circular repetition of what happened prior to that. And then in many cases, what's happened in the future is repeated multiple times, right? So just to give you an idea, and again, like I said, I would love to hear some comments on this one throughout the years and see what people think. But why is this genius, right? Why is this brilliant? First of all, I'll tell you why it's brilliant. And second of all, I'll present you one idea that could break this logic like this, okay? So the reason this type of spiral is brilliant is because we have based our entire life around that type of logic. So in school, by far the best way to learn something is through repetition, right? So you start with the basics, and just like the book of Genesis presents you a big picture world, you start with the basics, and then you slowly build upon it. But it always helps to take a break, and then go back to the beginning to reinforce what was learned. If you have a good teacher, that's exactly what that teacher would do, right? He would start off with the basics, slowly build on them, give you a break, and then take you back to the beginning and slowly expand on that knowledge so that you can grow in knowledge. This is not just in school, is it now? Sports is the same way. You take a bodybuilder, for example, you take a power lifter, they start with the basics, right? With low weights, one plate, half a plate, whatever, as long as it's on the floor or on the rack, it doesn't matter. You start slow and then you slowly build up strength, right? Once you get to a certain level, what do? Every time you warm up, you don't start with 700 pounds on the rack, right? Or on the floor. You start warming up with 135. And then down the road, once you build enough strength, your starting point is no longer 135 because you know you can lift that. You go to 225 as you warm up, right? So in a very similar fashion, this book takes you somewhere and then goes back to 75% 75% back to the beginning. And then it kind of slowly builds on your knowledge. And then it gives you a break through slightly easier language, strategically placed where it is so that it can reinforce. It gives your mind a break and reinforces through circular type of feedback loops. It reinforces your knowledge and then it builds more and more and more and more, right? And of course, nothing in life is linear. There's absolutely nothing in life that is linear. There's, let's just say, a corporation that grows, right? When a corporation grows, it can explode real fast, but at some point, someone has to go back and take a look at, for example, just the basics, the accounting of it. We need more personnel in accounting so that we can build the ground, right? So it kind of takes you back and then slowly builds on whatever is established so that it can grow, right, until it does not, and then it dies. This type of logic is also visible in just simple things like presentations. Let's just take a look at whenever you present something, they always teach you, whether it's in business school or at work, someone that guides you, he tells you, when you first start out, give us the big picture of what you're trying to do rather than jump right into the facts. The Bible does precisely the same thing, right? Or we do precisely the same thing. The Bible starts with the book of Genesis that gives you a big picture, creation of the universe, sin, redemption, destruction, and then once again, rebuilding. So you get a full picture and then you go into the details. Unfortunately, if you start somewhere else, you can get lost in the details, right? That's precisely why they tell you don't do that. Don't go straight into the details. Give people an idea of what you're talking about so that they don't get lost in the details, right? And this is precisely what I did shamelessly, right? I told you what I'm going to do, and then I went into the details, and then guess what's going to happen? I'm going to tell you exactly what I did, just like this book does it. It's because this is the easiest way for someone to understand logical thought processes. There's no other way that is as easy, okay? And there's also the concept of that we need to take a look back every now and then because we're going to get lost in the current events. We need to take a look back. This is what the entire idea of history and repetition is. Take a look back because A, it builds your foundational knowledge of the way things work, and B, you can see the progression and the direction you are going, right? That's the whole idea. So, okay, the last thing I was going to talk about is what is the one thing, and again, I've been thinking about this for a long time. There is one thing that potentially breaks the logic of this and just the entire idea collapses on its face. If you recall, I told you that there are, first of all, the assumption is that I'm going off of the King James Version of the Bible, which is a Protestant translation. And also the other thing that I told you is that there is a gap of about 400 or 500 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament, okay? So many people, especially the ones that lean towards atheist and agnostic, they tend to question the number of books that are included in the Bible, right? Why do some Bibles include more books? Why do others include fewer books, right? There's a set of books that are called the Apocrypha, okay? And those books, they fall, chronologically speaking, straight into that period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's no, outside of those books, there's no question as to which books are included, more or less, into the canonical order of the Bible. But there is this one set of books. They chronologically fit between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Those books, brilliantly, they're not part of the King James Version, King James translation of the Bible. Now, many current theologians that are looking into this, they say, well, it's because the translators of the King James Version, they said this is not part of these books are not part of the Jewish canon, therefore we're going to go with the Jewish canon, the Old Testament, right? The law, the prophets, wisdom, literature, but we're not going to include these books because they are not part of the Jewish canon, which of course is a valid statement. The other reason, which I strongly believe that these books are not part of it, is because they just simply do not fit the logic of the view that I just presented to you. They fit the chronological order, however, no one loops back to them. Chronologically after them in the New Testament, absolutely nobody loops back to these books. So they're just lateral material that is not bad reading, right? It's got nothing to do with their bad books or they're untrue. It's just that they don't fit at all in this logic. First of all, they're not part of the canon of the Old Testament, the Jewish canon. And second of all, they do not fit this loop back that takes you back to them. No one talks about these people. Nobody. Okay? So they're just hanging out there. And again, I am not against reading them. I just strongly believe they have no room in this book at all. Okay. So once again, the way that I view, and this is something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I've been trying to poke holes through it, the way that I look at this, at the logic of why certain books are placed where they are, is because it just reinforces knowledge if you read sequentially. You start chronological, deliberately takes you back. Continue chronology, deliberately takes you back. Continue chronology, takes you back. And then individually within each one of these loops, there's constant reinforcement of events that happened prior to that, so that it helps you, A, take a break, B, understand, and get the full picture, right? So anyway, as I mentioned, I would love to hear some comments on this type of, and keep it on topic, literally. I would hate to address other things that I don't care about at all, nor that I'm not going to address other things. But I hope this helps. I hope it gives you a different view of what in the world is going on in this book.